So the topic of this lesson is fractal noise, so let's get right to it. We'll select this layer in our fractal noise composition, bring up our effects palette, and let's start typing the word fractal. And by the time I get to FRAC, I've narrowed it down to the two fractal plugins that are in After Effects, the fractal generator and the fractal noise generator. Now, one thing that's new about After Effects 6 is that this separate noise category has been created, and fractal noise has been moved from the render folder to the noise folder. So if you're an old friend of fractal noise, it's moved to a new home. At any rate, although both of these plugins have the word fractal in them and both work based on fractal math, they actually produce very, very different things. Let's start by applying the regular fractal to our layer. The fractal filter is kind of old school computer graphics. Let's apply it real quick, and we'll see that it generates these pretty patterns based on fractal math. But, there's not much we can do with this. If you're really into fractals, you can choose from a Mandelbrot set, a Julia set, several combinations of Mandelbrots and Julias, etc. Plus, you have control over how to tweak the appearance of the fractal on screen. We can adjust the x-axis, for example, of our fractal to precisely position it on screen if we like, clicking and dragging it around. But you know what? This filter's fairly slow. This doesn't look like anything in the real world. Fractals are kind of old school, old news anyway. So it is fun and interesting to maybe generate some zooms into a fractal. And if you have the patience and maybe want to add colorama to the mix, you can zoom in and out of cool fractal geometry like what you see on screen here. But again, this is fairly old school. There's not a lot you can do to actually control the fractal. And the interface actually doesn't allow you to navigate very elegantly once you're zoomed way into a fractal, so it's fairly easy to get lost. I don't really love this plugin. There are actually better ways to do these kinds of fractal animations out there available on the net for free. So it's nice that this plugin is in After Effects, but it's not the one we want to talk about. We want to talk about fractal noise. So let's get rid of the fractal plugin from this layer, go back over to the effects palette, and let's apply the fractal noise plugin to our layer. Now I'll close down the effects palette, and let's take a look at our interface for fractal noise. Fractal noise is a Perlin noise generator. If you don't remember what Perlin noise is, I explained it in great detail back in the expressions section of this series. So if you need an explanation of how Perlin noise works, you can refer back to that. But this is a graphical representation of standard basic Perlin noise, and the fractal type pop-up allows us to choose a whole bunch of variations on noise. Turbulent smooth, turbulent basic, turbulent sharp. You can surf through all of these choices here to see the different kinds of fractal geometry that's possible to create with this plugin. But we're going to keep things set to basic for now. The noise type defaults to soft linear and gives us a few other options for how the noise is actually drawn on screen. Again, if you just play around with the various settings, you can see if you like one choice over the other. We're just going to keep these set to their default settings. The invert button inverts the pixel values that we see on screen, so what's black is white and what's white is black. Doesn't look like much with this choice, but if you were to choose something like, say, cloudy, which gives us this kind of puffy effect, and then invert that, you end up with something that looks a little bit more like strings, which is another preset that we have. So if you can't quite get exactly what you want, try getting something that looks like the opposite of what you want and just inverting it. Inverting has its uses, as we'll see as we move on. Let me set things back to basic. Now, contrast and brightness are ways to manipulate the luminance values of the pixels that we see on screen. They work exactly like the brightness and contrast controls that you see elsewhere in After Effects. In fact, I like these brightness and contrast sliders about as much as I like brightness and contrast elsewhere in After Effects, which is not much at all. I'd much prefer levels controls in here instead of brightness and contrast, which are very imprecise. But we'll make do with what we have. Contrast cranks up the contrast of the pixels, meaning that the white areas get whiter and the black areas get blacker. And by default, things clip off when they exceed those values. The overflow pop-up allows us to choose whether or not things get kind of rounded back or whether they wrap back on themselves, which can create these interesting sort of plasma effects. When you crank the contrast way up with wrap back turned on, you get these interesting lightning-y, noisy plasma effects, which can be kind of cool. I'm going to undo that a couple of times and get us back a little closer to our default settings. The transform settings are some of the most important settings in here because these are how you're actually going to fine-tune the appearance of your fractal on screen. Once you've decided what the kind of broad parameters are, you often need to go in and adjust and fine-tune what you see. You do that with the transform controls, which allow you to rotate the fractal if you like. For some reason, your noise isn't oriented properly. This can help. You can also scale your fractal. By default, you're scaling things uniformly, meaning the same amount in X as in Y, same amount side to side as up and down. But you can turn off uniform scaling and get access to separate sliders for width and height, which allows you to set up noise that looks much more striated, like, say, wood grain or water. We'll see several uses for this kind of distortion later on. Now try to adjust the rotation once you've stretched your fractal out, and you may not get exactly what you expect. You're not actually going to end up rotating the distortion so that the stripes go at a 45-degree angle or something like that. What's going on here is that the rotation of the fractal actually happens before the scaling of the fractal in the world of fractal noise. So essentially all you're doing is rotating the underlying noise map before it's distorted. This can be useful, but it also means that you can't really have an angled distortion mat without physically rotating the layer. That's a little bit of a drag, but it's easy enough to work around by precomposing. The offset control, that's the one down here that says offset turbulence, allows you to reposition the fractal on screen. This can be very, very useful, as we'll see shortly, if you want to create moving turbulence for one reason or another. This is how you do it, by adjusting the offset turbulence effect point. Now, attached to that is a perspective offset switch. And with the distortion that we have on screen right now, that's not going to be too terribly obvious. Let's go back up and click our reset button to bring back our normal noise. And if you remember the Perlin noise discussion that we had earlier on in this series, you know that what we're looking at here is several layers of increasingly detailed noise stacked on top of each other and scaled differently on top of each other. What the perspective offset button allows you to do is, if selected, when we now select and offset our background around, I need to actually select our plugin here so I can see the effect point. You'll see that instead of getting a straight move, we're seeing the different layers that are combined together moving at different speeds. It's kind of simulating a parallax shift. For the kind of noise that I have on screen right now, which is kind of cloudy, this can actually create what looks like a three-dimensional fog effect, which can be very, very useful. Of course, it also slows us down a bit. We can speed things up by setting things to half quality. Now we should get quite a bit better responsiveness, and we do. You can really see that 3D now because we're getting a higher frame rate. Pretty cool. Let's turn that back off and work our way down through the other controls. Perspective offset works by shifting the various layers that are composited together to create the noise that you see on screen. The number of layers is controlled by the complexity setting, which by default is 6. Crank that down, and you get fewer layers combined with each other, and you get smoother and smoother noise. Crank that up, obviously, and you get greater noise. The subsettings have to do with how the layers relate to each other. The sub-influence essentially has to do with the amount of transparency between the layers. As you change the influence, all layers contribute equally, and you get this kind of evenly distributed noise. As you crank the influence down, the larger layers influence things more than the smaller ones do, and you end up with big peaks and valleys with tinier bits of detail creating finer and finer noise in the intermediate areas. The subscaling has to do with exactly how much each subsequent layer is scaled. If you remember our lecture earlier on Perlin noise, subsequent layers have twice the frequency of noise at half the height and then are then combined with the previous layer. So the scaling has to do with how small each layer is as it's combined with the layer on top of it. Crank that to a smaller value, and you'll see the combined noise gets finer and finer as the subsequent layers get composited in smaller and smaller. Crank it up, and again, you'll see the noise gets smoother and smoother. So the subscaling can be a way that you fine-tune the amount of noise that you see on screen. The nice thing about using subscaling instead of complexity is the higher the complexity, the more layers there are to calculate. By fine-tuning the subscaling, you can simulate a higher complexity fractal, but only calculating a fractal that is technically the same complexity as a simpler fractal. Subrotation has to do with how much each subsequent layer is rotated as it's combined with its previous layer. That rotation occurs around the offset point, as you see here, by default, but you can override that by clicking on the center subscale switch down here. And the sub-offset actually allows you to control the offset of the layers. I've deselected my filter here. The offset of the individual layers that are combined separate from the offset of the entire fractal. So as you see dragging this around, we're moving the entire fractal. By adjusting the offset, we're moving the layers that are combined together that result in the final fractal. By animating both of these properties together, you can get some really, really interesting drifting noise type animations that can be very suitable for things like displacement maps for water, etc. Okay, moving down a little further in our settings, we find the evolution controls. And the evolution controls are among the most important controls in this filter. So let me close down our other settings, transform and subsettings, and I'll reset our filter to make sure everything is back at its default values. Now, fractal noise allows us to simulate a lot of natural systems, systems that occur in nature, things like water, smoke, fire, etc. And an important part of a lot of those systems is the idea that things rarely sit still or just move around. Things evolve over time. Smoke churns, fire flickers, water ripples. And all of those things can be simulated by adjusting the next control that you see here, the evolution angle. The evolution angle evolves the fractal over time so that you end up with churning fractal noise on screen. Very, very cool. This works, of course, with all of the different fractal types and allows you to create some really, really cool stuff, as you'll see. But another important thing is down here in the evolution options, and that is this little switch that allows you to cycle the evolution. Very often you might want to create a looping background. You might want to render, say, 3 seconds or 4 seconds of a water surface, but you want to use those in a 20-second comp. So you want them to be able to seamlessly loop. And you can do that very, very easily with the evolution options that you see right here. If I set a keyframe for evolution here at the beginning and go out, say, a couple of seconds, I'll hit Shift Page Down like 6 times, and that takes us out to 2 seconds. And I just change my number of evolutions to 1. That means over a 2-second time period, this fractal is going to evolve until it hits 2 seconds, and then it's pretty much going to park itself and sit still. And there we go. Now, if I go to 2 seconds here and hit Shift 1, that'll add a quick marker in the timeline that I can now jump to. If I tell the filter to cycle the evolution by turning on this switch, the default cycle in revolutions is set to 1, which means every time that it rotates around the evolution twirly here, we are going to come back to a frame that looks exactly the same as it did when we started. And I can confirm that now by hitting the I key to go to our endpoint, or hitting the number 1 to go to the marker that we just set. And in fact, both of them are absolutely identical, even though the fractal evolves smoothly from one state to the next. Now, if I'm not happy with the speed of this evolution, if I think it's great that we've looped over 2 seconds, but I need this to be evolving much, much faster, I need to go like 3 or 4 rotations before I get to 2 seconds, well, it's easy enough to crank around the rotations to 3 or 4 and snap to that. And sure enough, I'll still have a frame that looks exactly the same as the first frame that I started out, because every single rotation is going to end up back on this frame. If I jump out to 1 second, looky there, at exactly 1 second, I'm back at this same frame. So I'm obviously going to get a repeating cycle that every half second ends up back at the same frame that I started at, which is not really going to look very natural. So I could go to my evolution options and change my cycle and revolutions to 4, and now only after 4 revolutions will my screen repeat itself. So by using these controls carefully, you can create really nice repeating animations that will seamlessly loop. Very, very powerful thing. But a hugely important thing to know about this is that these controls will break as soon as you start animating any other geometric property that you see on screen. If you adjust any of the subsettings and animate them over time, if you animate any of these transform settings over time, particularly offset turbulence, which is something people often want to combine with a seamless loop, well, it's going to break the filter's ability to seamlessly loop, unfortunately. So let me close down my transform settings, my subsettings, my evolution controls. The last things we can adjust here in the filter are the random seed, which will allow us to create different fractals that may otherwise share the same settings as far as evolution and transform are concerned, but can still look different because they're based on a different random seed value. You've seen several examples of these as we've worked through the series. The opacity control allows us to blend our layer with our original layer, which in our case was just a bluish-green solid. And you have a whole bunch of transfer modes available to you as well to control precisely how the fractal interacts with the layer that it came from. Once again, I'm going to reset my controls so that we're back to the basics. I'm going to hit the U key to solo our evolution keyframes, select them and delete them, because we're going to take a look now at how the fractal noise filter works in conjunction with some other fun plugins. For example, fractal noise plays really well with Colorama. Let me close down our fractal noise filter here, bring back up our effects palette. Let me drag it in where we can actually see it and just quickly type Colora. That allows us to apply our Colorama filter. And I'll get rid of our effects palette. And you'll immediately see something fun here. If we go to our output cycle and start choosing some of our preset palettes, Ramp Gray, of course, gives us back our original, and Colorama allows us to remap the grayscale levels that you see out here to any of a number of choices in our Colorama palette. A quick choice on fire, for example, and trying out some of our other fractal noise types like turbulent smooth. Let's invert that. No, let's not use that. How about dynamic? Oh, that's kind of nice. We'll invert that again, and that gives us kind of these puffy cloud looks, which is really cool. And now if we evolve that, we set a keyframe for evolution and jump back out a couple of frames and crank our evolution cycles out to, say, 2, you can see that we can pretty quickly generate what looks like interesting churning fire on screen. Now, it's not seamlessly cycling. You'll remember we actually have to set our evolution properties to cycle over 2 revolutions, which is what I just set up. So let's do that real quick. We'll tell it to cycle revolutions and cycle every 2 times around, which should work just fine. Let's take a look at that. Ah, yes, very nice. And pretty much seamlessly cycles. We've got an extra frame there at the end we need to trim off because, as we've mentioned several times before, if you have the same exact value on the first frame and the last frame of a cycling animation, you'll get a little bit of a hiccup. It's very, very easy to adjust by simply moving the second keyframe 1 frame past the end of your work area, or moving your work area 1 frame in. But we're not going to worry too much about that now. And at this point, if you like, you could just sit down and experiment with this stuff all day, because there's all sorts of presets in here. They're fun to play with. There are all sorts of colors that you can map things to. And really, frankly, with very little fuss, you can create really gorgeous backgrounds with a few clicks of the mouse, the fractal noise filter, and the Colorama filter working together. But with a few additional tips, you can actually create incredibly realistic-looking special effects. And I don't mean realistic in that kind of fiery way that we just saw. That's pretty cool-looking churning balls of fire. But we can actually create much more interesting effects than that with a little more work. Now let's take a look at that. If I twirl down my fractal noise and get rid of my Colorama for this particular effect, I open back up fractal noise. I don't want things to evolve right now, so I'm going to select and get rid of my evolution keyframes down there and reset my effect. So we're back to our old happy neutral noise. Let me close up my effects palette just a little bit. And I'm going to choose something like dynamic, which gives us these turbulent clouds, the same ones we applied our fire color map to a little bit earlier. I'm going to invert it so that instead of highlighting the poofy parts of the clouds, we're actually going to be highlighting the little bits of brightness that you see here on screen now that look like threads. I'm going to crank up our contrast quite a bit. We're going to be fine-tuning a lot of these things that I'm doing sort of roughly right now. I'm going to crank down my brightness so that all we see are these hills. And now I'm going to open up my transform settings and I'm going to crank our scale down, way down. I'm going to crank it down from 100 down to about 4. And now by cranking up my contrast a little bit more and our brightness down a little bit more, we should be able to reduce this map to just points of light. And what we end up with is a reasonably decent facsimile of a star field. Cool. So let me shut down my fractal noise controls now, bring back up our effect control palette, and let's apply the set channels filter to that. Close that down and tell it to get alpha from the luminance of the layer. So now we've actually created stars on a transparent background. I'm going to hit the home key to go back to our very first frame and hit Control Y on the PC or Command Y on the Mac and create a new layer. We'll call it Sky Color. Comp size is, of course, preferable. We'll add that and we'll send it to the back with our keyboard shortcut, which is Control-Shift-Left bracket. So now we've got stars kind of hovering over a dark green image, which is not exactly what we're after. We could create what looks like an earthly night sky by now applying the ramp filter to the layer that we just added, the sky color layer. We can drag right on top of it here, and that's now added the ramp to the layer behind our stars. I know it's kind of hard for you to see on video, but you can just see the little details of the stars peeking out here. If we change the end color of our ramp to a nice dark blue, even darker than the darkest blue in the chipset selector over here, and click OK, you can start to see, if I zoom in on this a little bit, exactly what I'm trying to create. A nice starry background, fairly realistically done and created in After Effects. Now at this point, there's all sorts of stuff you could do to these stars. You could add a 4-color gradient to them if you liked, which would colorize the stars to different colors. So now we have a little bit of yellow and a little bit of blue in here if we like. We could even apply a fractal noise to the background sky and create more of a nebula effect by applying colorama to that background layer. Basically, there's just tons and tons of stuff that you can do by just mixing and matching these filters. But a sky is not necessarily a very dynamic thing. I mean, we could animate some of our evolution options to make the stars twinkle if you like, and you might want to duplicate the layer and blur a copy to make the stars glow a little bit. But we're not going to go too far down that road in this explanation because a sky full of stars tends to pretty much just sit there. There's much more dynamic stuff that we can do with this filter. Let me close down our effects palette and delete our set channels effect and delete our 4-color gradient effect. We don't want that. And I'm going to once again reset our fractal noise, get rid of our starry background here, and bring us back to our normal run-of-the-mill fractals. I'm also going to double-click our work area here and get rid of this marker that we have down the timeline. We're not going to deal with that again. Now let's talk about creating some fairly realistic water-type effects using fractal noise. The first place I want to go to is our transform controls, of course. And I'm going to scroll them up here a little bit and turn off uniform scaling because we want a wider effect than tall. We'll adjust the height a little bit, but I'm going to crank the width way out there to give us a nice streaky effect that we see here. So almost, well, right at 2000 for the width. That looks pretty good. A nice, smooth, wide effect there. Our next goal is to animate our evolution settings. We don't really care so much about cycling our evolution because we're also going to be animating our offset turbulence, and we know that that's going to mess things up. So for now, I'm just going to set a keyframe for evolution. I'm going to jump to the last keyframe by hitting the end key. And I want a fairly quick evolution. The composition here is 5 seconds long. So let's try 10 revolutions and see if that's not too fast. That's going to give us a pretty quick evolution. We may find that this is a little too speedy, but we can always go back and adjust this, of course. Nothing we do here is permanent or set in stone. And the next thing I'm going to try is animating the offset of the fractal effect so that we get a nice motion of flow in the fractal. So let me jump back to our frame 1 by hitting the home key. And this time we're going to set a keyframe for offset turbulence. Let me type the U key real quick to bring that property down here in the timeline. There it is. Now I'm going to hit the end key to jump to the end of our composition, and I'm going to hit the comma key to zoom out a ways here because what I want to do with our fractal noise filter highlighted so I can actually see the controls in here is I'm going to click right in the center of the layer, and that's going to select the offset turbulence point, and I'm going to drag that up. And as you can see, as I'm dragging, it's a very small view at this point, but I can actually drag pretty far out into the pasteboard when I'm zoomed out far like this. It's the only way to physically drag something this far off. You can, of course, drag on the numerical sliders, but you won't get any kind of visual feedback as to how far things are flowing. I'm going to go about 3 widths away from the center point here, and then zoom back in. And now let's jump back to frame 0 and take a quick look at what our animation looks like. Well, let me just preview a couple seconds of that, and we'll see that it looks like fairly rapidly moving fractal noise. Might be evolving a little too quickly. So let me double click on my last evolution keyframe and change that value from 10 revolutions down to, say, 6 or so. And we'll take a look at the results of that. And that's a little better. We still got fast motion, but the evolution isn't quite so frantic. So we've got smoother evolution of our noise. That's good. This is a very creative, artistic process. You've got a lot of tweaking to do to get these effects to look exactly the way you think they should look to your eye. But these are just some of the steps that you might typically go through. Let me open up our effects palette again. And this time we're going to go for the corner pin filter. This is another production bundle distortion filter. You've seen it earlier in the series very briefly demonstrated. But in essence, what the corner pin filter does, if I zoom out a little bit in the comp window, you'll see that the corner pin filter now adds these 4 control points to a layer. And by adjusting these control points, I can actually distort the layer with a perspective distortion. You'll notice that as the distortion moves around, After Effects is attempting to create a perspective effect based on the position of the 4 corners. We're going to use that perspective effect to our advantage by grabbing and dragging out the bottommost effect control points of the corner pin effect. I'm going to drag them pretty far away, at least half of the width out of the composition. And if I zoom out a little bit further, you can see the relative position of both of those points. I'll zoom back in again, and I need to nudge them down just a bit because I'm getting a little bit of the background showing through the bottom here because of how the corner pin is calculating things. But the results of this should be a nice perspective noise now, where the foreground noise looks a little bit larger and seems to be moving faster and then recedes into the top of the screen. And the resulting image should look as if we're viewing a noisy surface from a slight angle. Sure enough, that's kind of what we're getting there. A little bit of flow away from us. You'll see that it looks like it's moving a little slower at the top than it is at the bottom. That adds to the sense of perspective. So as always, you can tweak this sort of thing to suit your taste, but I'm going to call this OK for now. And I'm going to select this fractal noise layer and pre-compose it. Control-Shift-C or Command-Shift-C on Windows. And we'll call this our fractal map composition. And it's very important that you choose the second option, Move All Attributes into the new composition. We're not going to open the composition. We'll just click OK. Now we have a composition to work with, and because the pixels are being calculated in a pre-comp, we can actually use these pixels not only as a source for color, which is an easy way to create the next step of our effect, but also as a displacement map, which will allow us to do some fairly cool things. We'll call up our effects palette again real quick. Once again, we'll apply Colorama and add it to our fractal noise layer. And immediately we get a fairly striking effect. Not terribly realistic, of course. We basically got something that looks like radioactive waste flowing by now. But if we go into our output cycle, there's a preset in here that's tailor-made for this kind of animation. And that preset is called Caribbean. Choose the Caribbean setting, and we're 90% of the way towards realistic water. And a quick preview shows us, we've got really interesting animation going on here. It's a little bit fast, it's a little bit frantic, but still, you get the gist of it. Looks like the water's flowing by us pretty closely here. I actually am going to adjust the speed of this a little bit. I'm going to hold down the Alt key, double-click on our fractal map layer, select our fractal noise layer, hit F3 to bring up the effects palette for that, and type the U key to see the keyframes that we have to work with. I'm going to double-click my second keyframe for offset, and I think I'm going to not move quite so far on the Y-axis. I moved minus 1282. Let's just set that to something like minus 800. That'll be a more manageable speed, I think. And evolution, I'm also going to adjust down a little bit. I've got 6 revolutions, 0 degrees. Let's take that down to 4 revolutions. And both of those things should have the effect of slowing down our water. If I go back into my fractal noise layer and regenerate the RAM preview for that layer, you'll see, much nicer. It's moving a little slower. We can see the evolution of the fractal as it moves by. We've still got that sense of liquid flowing by, and it looks really, really nice. So now that we've tweaked our water effect a little bit, let's see what else we can do with this same fractal map to add to our scene. And I'm going to add a text layer to the mix. So I'll hit Control-Y, Command-Y on the Mac, and create a layer. I'm going to call it Text. Click OK. Bring up our effects palette. Type in Basic, and that gives me Basic 3D or Basic Text. I'm just going to apply Basic Text. And I'm going to use a font called Squaresville. You can use whatever you like, whatever's available on your system. And I'm going to make up a movie title here, or a TV show title, Monkeys from the Deep. Okay, so we've got our Monkeys from the Deep layer. I'm going to crank up the size a bit so that it's more appropriate for our scene. And I'm going to set the quality to full quality. Now, normally at this point, I would make fun of the fact that the basic text filter always comes up with bright red text, and who the heck ever wants to work with bright red text? But dang it, I'm going to make some sense out of this by actually sticking with bright red text and just cycling through my transfer modes and see if I can find something that I like that works with this particular shade of red. So I'm going to hold down the Shift key and type the plus and minus keys at the top of the keyboard to cycle through my transfer modes. Don't like that one. Well, I don't have to go very far before I find a couple of the darken style modes. I don't want the lighter ones. That's a little too bright. But these darker style modes work pretty well. Very easy to read, but you can also see some highlights of the liquid there affecting things, which is pretty cool. All right, zoom out just a little bit. Bring back our effects palette and once again apply the corner pin filter to our text layer. This time I'm going to adjust our Monkeys from the Deep image so that it looks kind of like it's resting on top of the surface of our water, by giving it just a little bit of perspective, probably not as dramatic a perspective as necessary for this as we used for the water itself. But that gives us a pretty good perspective effect. A quick glance down on my timeline shows that I've added this layer at about the 4-second mark, which means that it's not going to appear before 4 seconds. We don't like that, so I'm going to hold down the Alt key, Option key on the Mac, and hit the Home key, which will snap the selected layer back to frame 0. Nice tip there. Hit the Home key by itself to take us back to frame 0. And while this is already looking pretty nice, I kind of like it, I wouldn't mind some motion on the text as if the text was being affected by the water. So to do that, let's apply a displacement map. You've already seen a little bit of displacement maps from Steve. This is going to be another nice application of a displacement map. Bring back our effects palette and type in DISP for displacement map, and we'll add that to our layer. If you remember the description of the displacement map, you need to select the layer that you want to actually use as your displacement. This is really why we had to pre-compose the effect. We could have done everything we've done up to this point just by using Colorama and our original layer, but if we want to use that layer as a displacement map, we had to pre-compose it. If I choose the fractal map as our displacement source, you'll see that now the layer is affected by the luminance of the pre-composed fractal map layer. And we can fine-tune and adjust how much horizontal displacement. And in this case, probably better to use more vertical displacement, even to where we get a little bit of breakup, which kind of looks a little bit like refraction through the water. And the results are a title that may be a little more difficult to read, but definitely looks like it's floating on the surface of our liquid. As before, fine-tune to suit your tastes. Might not want quite so much displacement. Just a little bit of gentle displacement might be enough to show us our text being distorted on the surface of our liquid here. And of course, you might also be saying, hey, couldn't I do all of this with the caustics filter? Yes, you could. This map that we just generated here is a perfect source map for using with caustics so that you could get true displacement through liquid of our Monkeys from the Deep title. But this is just a quick and dirty approach to creating a nice realistic liquid effect using the fractal noise filter. And as we're playing full speed, you'll see we've got, hey, pretty decent effect. Might want to add back in a little more horizontal displacement. Right now the vertical displacement looks great, but we might want to see a little bit more distortion in the horizontal. And you might want to go back and continue to tweak the speed of this effect. It's possible that we're still flowing a little bit too quickly, but hey, this is After Effects. It's all being cranked out on the fly, so you can always go back and tweak stuff. Now, let's move away from creating these liquid-style animations and see what else exactly we can do with fractal noise that might also contribute to realistic effects. We close down the effects window, and let me close down this composition, and we'll open up the next composition in the project window, Old Film. And what we have in this composition is a spectacular effects shot created for an earlier Total Training series featuring Steve Holmes and friends down at street level, scared to death of a horrible giant monkey being that is poised way up on top of the Empire State Building. Here he is coming into view. Ghastly, horrible monkey fighting a couple of state-of-the-art, brand-new aircraft flying around. Well, you get the picture. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this image and we're going to make it look old. We want to make it not look like it was shot on fairly contemporary video, but actually shot with old film. This comes up quite a bit, and there's certainly third-party filters out there that allow you to do a lot of what you can see here, but you can really get a lot of the way towards a very satisfactory effect by using just the built-in controls in After Effects. So let me give you a little recipe here. Now, there's going to be a whole stack of filters and even a couple of extra layers involved with this effect. So I'm just going to blast through things fairly quickly. Feel free to tag along if you like. We're going to start out by selecting our layer and bringing up our effects and applying Colorama. Of course, as I said earlier, Colorama plays a part in just about everything that I do. I love Colorama. Let me get rid of our effects palette and let's dial in an output cycle that makes a little bit of sense. Let's choose not Solarized Red, but let's choose one of the sepias. They're actually up here at the top of the second portion of the list. You're only going to see this truncated like this on Windows machines. But let's try Sepia 2. That looks pretty good. It's a little too extreme for my taste, so now that we've adjusted the color, let's actually bring some of the original image back in by adjusting the Blend with Original slider. I'm going to crank that over until we just start seeing some of the original color coming back in. At a value of around 50%, for example, we can now scrub through our timeline and see that we've definitely faded out this video quite a bit. Let me actually crank it down a little further to have even more sepia in here, down to about 30%. That really fades things back, but you can just see a hint of color here and there, which really makes this look like a color film that's just faded out over the ages. All right, that's step one. Close down Colorama. And next, we're going to apply a filter that I've told you 50 times not to use up to this point, and that's brightness and contrast. Levels is better than brightness and contrast in almost every way. But for this kind of quick and dirty recipe, I'm actually going to apply it because I'm going to control the brightness and contrast with an expression. So let me bring up our effect control palette and type in BRIH to give us brightness and contrast. We'll add that to the mix, close out our effects palette. And now I want to see these controls in the timeline, so I'm going to right-click on Brightness, or Control-click on the Mac on Brightness, and choose Reveal in Timeline, and that just opens up our effects and our brightness and contrast controls down here in the timeline. I don't need my parenting column, and I will need to see what I'm typing with expression, so let me just right-click on Parenting and choose Hide This, so we can see things here a little more clearly. And I'm going to set expressions for contrast and expressions for brightness. For contrast, I'm going to hold down the Alt key and click on the stopwatch to enable an expression. And the expression I'm going to type is wiggle, open parentheses, 5, that's 5 times per second, comma, 10. Means I'm going to take my original contrast value and 5 times a second, I'm going to wiggle that value a maximum of 10 in either direction. Click Enter. And now if we hit the space bar, you'll see our contrast up in the window here is just slightly uneven now. It pulses. You get a little bit of wiggle in the contrast. We're going to do a similar thing to the brightness. Going to once again Alt-click on the stopwatch, Option key on the Mac, and type in wiggle again. And this time we'll try some different numbers. Let's do our brightness 2 times per second and set a maximum value of, say, 25. So our brightness value will get 25% brighter and 25% darker twice a second, or up to that amount at least. And now the combination of both the contrast and the brightness wiggling gives us some nice results of flicker in our image. That's working pretty well. Now, in addition to wiggling the brightness and contrast, I actually want to wiggle the timing of this layer. We now have a smooth pan from 1 second down up to the top. That smooth pan is actually really lovely, but if we wiggled the timing of this a little bit, we'd end up with some stuttering that would look as if we had an old piece of film that might have even broken a couple of times or is jumping around in the sprockets a little bit. So we're going to affect time remapping. Let me enable time remapping for this layer by holding Control-Alt-T on Windows, Command-Option-T on the Mac. Hit my hand tool to reveal our time remapping keyframes. And now we're going to apply a wiggle command to our time remapping. But wiggling time is a little bit different. I'm going to hold down the Alt key and click on the stopwatch here. And I'm going to type in an expression that we haven't seen yet, although it's very similar to something that we've just looked at. This one, though, is called temporal wiggle. So I'm going to type in temporal _ wiggle, and this will wiggle things in time. I don't need to affect things very much, so I'm going to type a value of 1, meaning once per second. I want to wiggle a value of 0.1, meaning a tenth of a second. Remember, everything having to do with time is calculated in seconds. So I'm basically asking the time remapping keyframes to wiggle themselves only as much as a tenth of a second. But that should give us a little bit of a sense of stopping and starting that will add a lot to this effect. So let's RAM preview that and see where it gets us. You'll see that now our smooth pan has some jumps in it. Very subtle, but they're enough to really add just a hint of realism to this footage. Kind of looks like a bad RAM preview, but in fact that's actually in the footage now, which is great. Okay, now film has a problem, particularly old film, with something called gate weave. Gate weave means the film can actually move back and forth in the sprockets and even move up and down a little bit as the film is passing through a camera. So let's wiggle the position of our image a little bit, not too much. Too much wiggle in this case can really start to make things look fakey. So we're going to be pretty subtle about this, but let's actually wiggle our positional value just a smidge. Let's bring up our positional value for the layer by typing the letter P. I'm going to enable an expression for the layer, and I'm going to type in, once again, wiggle. Gotta love wiggle. It's my favorite expression. And we're going to wiggle once per second, and we're going to wiggle a value of 6. Now, this is a value in pixels. We're just going to be wiggling 6 pixels once a second, and that's a maximum value. So what we should get out of this is some very subtle positional movement over time. And as we glance at the comp window, hit the space bar, you'll see that we're actually generating a situation that's revealing a little bit of transparency around the edges here. As we're wiggling the position of our layer, we're actually bringing the layer in and giving us some obvious artifacts around the sides that are undesirable. So in addition to this, we're going to have to scale up our layer just a little bit to compensate. So let me set things to best quality. Right now we're in draft, and instead of position, we'll solo the scale property. And I'm just going to select scale and type in a slightly larger value. It doesn't have to be much bigger. Let's say about 102%. And that should be more than enough to compensate for 6 pixels. And in fact, it seems to be just fine. If you find in your situation you need to change this value just a little bit, you can bump it up to 103 or 104. This also has the side effect of very slightly softening our image a little bit, which can also go partway towards making video look like bad film. In fact, let's randomize the softness of the image just a little bit, because occasionally in a bad piece of old film, you get these random blurs that go one way or another as the film can jump around inside the camera. So let's see how we can add that. I'll bring up our effects window again. We'll type in DIRE for directional blur, and let's apply that. And we're going to, this time, set keyframes both for direction and blur length and hit the U key to solo those properties down in the timeline so that we can see them. Let me scroll up, and I'm going to set expressions for direction and for blur length. For direction, I'm going to set an expression with our shortcut, and this time, instead of a wiggle effect, I'm going to type in a random effect. I'm going to type in random 360. That means we're randomly going to pick a direction to blur in. And next, for blur length, I'm going to do something very slightly more complicated. I don't want to blur every single frame. I only want a frame every now and then to kick out a little bit of a blur. If I twirl open my blur length, I'll see that I have a slider that goes from 0 to 20. And even if I chose Edit Value for the slider control, I'll see my minimum value that I can possibly choose is 0. So I cannot have a blur value less than 0. I can use that to my advantage with some simple math. Let me cancel out of this. And when I did that, I accidentally turned off my expression, so I can just turn it back on again by clicking on the equal sign that you see here with the slash through it. And that re-enables the expression, and now we can see that our numbers are red again, meaning that we're controlled by an expression. And I'm going to pick random numbers again, so I'm going to type in random. But the next thing I'm going to type is actually going to create randomness that only occurs every now and then. I'm going to type random 100, which means it's going to generate a random value from 0 to 100. But a blur value of 100 is going to be tremendously high, and we don't want that. I don't want a blur value of any more than about 5. So I'm typing random 100, close parentheses, and then minus 95. That means it's going to generate a random number from 0 to 100, and then it's going to subtract 95 from that random value. So 95 times out of 100, it's going to generate a random value that by the time we subtract 95 is going to result in 0 blur. So 19 frames out of 20 frames, we're not going to see any blur up here. But on average, about every 20th frame or so, it's going to kick out a random value higher than 95. Let's say it's 98. And then 98 minus 95 will return a blur length of 3, and we'll actually see a 3-pixel blur up here in the window. And we'll only see this on average every 20 frames or so. So let me accept that. That's okay. And if we generate a RAM preview of this, you'll see we've got a fairly subtle effect here. And it'll change as our layer order changes as well, as you learned in the expression series. But particularly when I'm up at the top of the tower there, you can see an occasional little blur kind of pop in. It just adds a kind of subtle touch to the proceedings. A little bit of occasional blur. That's just that extra bit of grunge that makes it look like bad film. Amazing how much effort we put into making a piece of film look like bad film, isn't it? All that money spent on restoring old films to pristine quality, and here we are taking something nice and making it look crummy. Okay, another earmark of old film, another visual cue that a piece of film is old, is that the aperture that the film was often shot with earlier cameras, particularly inexpensive cameras, would very often create a kind of a vignette effect where we would get a little bit of darkening in the corners. And it's amazing how just adding this little bit of detail can add to the realism of an old film effect. So let's do that real quick. Let me jump back home. So we add this at the very first frame. I'm going to add a new solid. Let's pick a color from our layer, just sort of a dark brown there. We'll call this layer vignette, and I'll try to spell it correctly. Make sure it's the comp size. Click OK. Now, obviously, things go away up here. I'm going to bring up my tool palette where I can see it. And we want to use an oval mask and draw an oval that kind of fills the screen, crops off some bits of the oval. It looks pretty good. Now let's bring up our mask parameter down here in the timeline and click the invert button. And then type the F key to bring up the mask feather. Click and drag that to the right. And that'll feather our mask. We want to feather it to a pretty high amount. So let's pick something around 165 or so. Go back and select my main selection tool. And our tool palette can now go away. I can also hide our mask so I can see what's going on. I'll do that with Control-Shift-H. And let's try out a few different transfer modes. I'm going to hit Shift+. We don't want to dissolve, obviously. But as we move along, we'll find one of the burn filters I think is actually going to do us pretty well. In fact, this looks extreme at this transparency setting. This is going to be the color burn transfer mode. If I expand this out, you can see it's a classic color burn. So let's take our transparency down now to quite a bit lower than what we have here. Got it down to about 15% now. Now, the classic burn is pretty good because not only do we get this vignette effect in the corner, but it also kind of increases the contrast of the corners. Now, I'm looking at this on a fairly dark portion of our movie, so let's scroll forward to a lighter portion and see if it has the desired effect. And yeah, it's giving us a hint of darkness in the corners that I really like. It's a very subtle effect we're after here, but that's working pretty well. It's just a little bit of burnout in the various corners. So now we've treated the image portion of our film. It's time to kind of schmutz things up a little bit. And if you'll remember, about half an hour ago, we used to be talking about the fractal noise filter, where we're going to reintroduce it now, and we're going to use fractal noise to add some of the other little bits and pieces to this old film effect. So let me jump back home, and let's create a new solid, Control Y, Command Y on the Mac, and we'll call this Noise. Click OK, bring up our effects control palette, and let's add fractal noise. Send my effects palette away, expand out our effects palette here so we can see exactly what we're doing. For a fractal type, I'm going to choose something like, let's see, turbulent sharp. No, let's not use that. Let's use one of the dynamic ones again. That's pretty good. And I'm going to crank up my contrast as we did before. I'm going to add the shift key while I'm cranking to really accelerate this process. And I'm going to take my brightness up until I just have a few of these little black bits of junk on screen. A few little black bits of junk. Crank my contrast up again, even higher. Our brightness up, even higher. Sharper edged bits of junk. All right? Now I'm going to go to my transform settings and scale these down a little bit. Probably more than enough. So let me crank my brightness up again to get rid of all but a few of the bits of noise that we see here on screen. That's good. And now I'm going to quickly set a keyframe for evolution. But then I'm going to hit the U key so that we can see evolution down here in the timeline. And as before, I'm going to set an expression. Turn on an expression for the layer, and we're going to type in random. And I just want random noise on every single frame, completely random. So I'm going to enter in a very high value. Let's go 10,000. So it's going to generate a random value from 0 to 10,000 and plug that into our evolution value on every single frame. And the results of that, if I hit the space bar, are just bits of random noise that show up on frame. Great. Now obviously we've got black noise on a white background, so we need to choose a mode that makes sense with that. Let's just choose darken. And now that gives us little dark bits on screen with every single frame. So as we move through our layers here, there's one of those blurs that we like. You'll also see little occasional random pieces of noise showing up. They're subtle on screen right now, but when they play back at full speed, they really go a long way towards making things look like crummy film. See all that noise? Just great. Okie doke, so we've added some noise. As I push the space bar there, you'll see, yep, that looks pretty good. Convincing noise. A lot of dust on screen. Now let's add some scratches. And we'll do that again with another copy of our fractal noise filter. Making sure that we're on frame 0, I'll add another layer, and we'll call this layer scratches. And I want to add the fractal noise filter again. That's the last filter I applied, so I'm going to mention a keyboard shortcut here that I haven't mentioned yet anywhere in this series, and that's the Apply Last Filter keyboard shortcut. And one reason I rarely mention it is because it involves so many keys it's rarely worth using. But basically mash your left hand on the keypad to make sure that you have pushed down as many keys as possible, and then hit the letter E. What I'm really looking for you to push down is Control, Alt, Shift, and then E on Windows, Command, Option, Shift, E on the Mac, and that will apply the last filter that you applied again. So we've just now applied the fractal noise filter to our scratches layer. Now what we want to do is adjust the transform controls. We're going to scale our noise here to give ourselves some very vertical noise. I'm going to turn off uniform scaling, and on my scale height setting, I'm going to enter in a ridiculously high value, again, like 10,000 or so. And look what that gives us. It just gives us these nice, smooth, vertically straight lines. And I'm going to adjust some evolution settings on those so that those lines animate. I'll scroll down and set a keyframe for evolution. Let me jump to the last frame by hitting the End key, and I'll type in a value of about 10 or so. Let me come back home, and a quick tap on the space bar shows us a fairly quick evolution there. Perhaps not quite as fast as we want, so let me solo these properties by typing the letter U, and we'll jump to that last keyframe. I'll double-click on it, I'm going to crank up the number of revolutions to something like, I don't know, let's try 18. And that should give us some quicker motion in our fractal. And of course, it's hard to tell as it's playing along right here, but I think this is going to work a little bit better for us. But usually when you see scratches on a piece of film, they aren't just evolving over time. They tend to be moving sort of from side to side. So I'm going to animate the offset values of this fractal as well. Let's jump back to frame 0. Set a keyframe for offset turbulence. Hit the end key to jump to the end of our composition. And I'm going to crank the offset turbulence value here to the right. Let me add the shift key to move even faster. I'm going to crank it way over till we get 2,000 or 3,000 or so to the right. Now, a quick tap on the spacebar shows me that our lines are moving fairly quickly from one side to the other. Possibly not quickly enough, so let me hit the end key again and add even more to that offset value. Let's take it up to about 5,000 or so. Now we get much quicker motion, which is fine. And lastly, to turn these vertical lines into scratches, we're going to go back to our brightness and contrast. We're going to crank our contrast way, way up until we see almost nothing but absolutely black and white on screen. And now we're going to adjust our brightness down until we've only left a couple of tiny little slivers of white on screen. And now as I tap the space bar, you'll see a little bit of white coming and going. Pretty soon you'll find these kind of maximum places where you get a lot on screen. That's obviously too much. So let's crank our brightness even further down until that becomes manageable. And nothing for a while, which is fine. And then a little bit more shows up, a little flicker every now and then. That's all we're after. Now you could invert this if you liked, if you wanted to have black scratches on our film, or occasionally you have lighter colored scratches. We're actually going to choose a lighter transfer mode than what we've chosen before. Actually, let's just find a frame where we know we have some scratches on screen. That's a pretty good one. And let me hold down the Shift key and hit plus until we cycle through a few transfer modes until we get to the lighter transfer mode. So there's Add, there's Lighten, there's Screen, Linear Dodge, Color Dodge, Classic Color Dodge. I like Linear Dodge. That gives us a lighter colored scratch here on screen, but it also affects the color of what we're seeing a little bit, as if we've actually scratched the emulsion on the screen a little bit. Now this has been an awful lot of work, but let's generate a quick RAM preview and let's see what we've created with these few steps. And at this point in the game, I am pretty darned satisfied with the results here. There's always things to tweak. You might want to add some white noise in addition to the black noise. You might want to blur back a copy of the black noise and take its transparency way down and then use it with a transfer mode like Color Dodge or something to add some really ugly splotches if you really want to make this look like damaged film. You could also create a copy of our lines layer and have it offset in the other direction so that you don't only have lines scratching from the left to the right, but you also have some going from right to left. Or you might prefer having darker lines instead of lighter lines. If you wanted to skinny up some of these incredibly fat lines, that's as simple as going over to the scale width slider and adjusting down the width of the fractal map. But for the most part, you should have a pretty good grasp at this point of the steps required to put together a fairly complex effect like this. Not only the scratched up old film version, but the actual effect itself with King Brian up on top of the Empire State Building. And that basically wraps up our look at the fractal noise filter. It wraps up our look at the production bundle elements, and in fact, that wraps up our look at Adobe After Effects, at least this time around.